Welcome to episode 4. In this episode we're going to look at how Ireland recovered from the famine and how changes were slowly introduced to the Irish diet throughout the 20th century.
EPIC is Ireland's emigration museum. It opened 5 years ago in a warehouse built in 1820, which was designed to store tobacco, wine, tea and spirits.
So if you can start by just telling me a little bit about the Irish diet before the famine.
Yeah, so the Irish diet before the famine was quite limited, particularly among the lower classes in society, the cottiers and the agricultural labourers. The potato was the main staple. It was introduced to Ireland around 1586, having arrived in Europe about 20 years previously, coming from South America and imported by the Spanish. It wasn't adopted as widely elsewhere for some time, but the working class in Ireland were heavily in favour of the potato. They became quite reliant on it for their diet. It was fairly limited. They would have the potato, particularly the lumper variety. They would also supplement that with a little bit of butter, a little bit of milk. Sometimes they would cook them, boil them in a pot and use a little bit of salt and pepper, occasionally a little bit of fish, mainly herring along the west coast, or they would cook them in the embers and eat them with their fingers.
So then a bit leading up to the famine, this kind of the socio-political factors, there's disparity growing. Was there between the diet and with wealth? Was it getting worse and worse, or was it kind of steadier?
Yeah, so the system in Ireland leading up to the famine was definitely under pressure. So there was obviously a hugely increasing population on the island, as mentioned. The very little cash was the economy of the lower member society. The very little cash was involved in that system. They would have their acre of land. They would have a very meagre cabin made out of mud and grass. They would work in exchange for that grant or that potato field. They would work up to 200 days a year for a small tenant farmer or for a larger farmer. So they weren't paid directly in cash for that. So the only way that they kind of supplemented their incomes was through kind of cottage industries that started to take off in the free time that they had. So they would do basket making, they would do millinery, they would do leather working, shoemaking and so on, sell those goods to bring a little bit of money in to help pay any rents that were due if the labour wasn't sufficient, or to buy materials and goods that they could kind of complement their diets with as well.
What caused the famine?
It's a big question, but the primary cause was a blight on the potato, particularly the lumper variety that so many people in Ireland were reliant on. It's assumed that between the 1830s and 1840s, about 90% of the diet of a third of the people on the island, so nearly 3 to 4 million people, was made up primarily of the lumper potato. So when that failed, obviously it had a dramatic effect on Irish society. The blight itself actually came from New England, so it was first recorded around the early 1840s, 1843, around Pennsylvania, New England. It was brought to Europe in a batch of seed potatoes that landed in Belgium. It spread across the continent from 1845 onward, arriving in Ireland toward the end of that year, and gradually growing worse, spreading from east to west over the next year, and started to impact on most of the crop all across the island.
Why didn't people, say, hunt or gather during the famine? Why was there such a reliance on the potato?
Yeah, so as mentioned, I suppose the yield of the potato, 6 tonnes a year, was sufficient to feed a relatively large family on an acre of land. So the amount of land that they had was limited. The cost of alternate grains and seeds was quite high, and mostly the land held by these people was very marginal. It could be mountainous, it could be waterlogged. It wasn't suitable to grow very much else. That's one of the reasons the lumper potato thrived so much, is that it could be grown in these conditions. And as the population expanded, people were pushed into more and more marginal lands. You'll see on the mountainsides of Ireland still remains of the lazy beds that they used to grow these crops, even to this day, land that's never been used since. So they weren't in a position to grow much else. In terms of hunting and foraging for other alternate food sources, by the stage that people became desperate enough to try and find these sort of foodstuffs to supplement their diet, there was very little. You can imagine there was a couple of million people who were looking for alternate foodstuffs. They had very little money, they couldn't purchase them. Thefts did take place. They did try to raid other farms to find food. People were growing desperate. Often they were very weak as well. They weren't in a position to do anything strenuous. They were suffering from cholera, they were suffering from typhus, they were dying in some cases. Where they could, they turned to soup kitchens to supplement their diet. They tried to find work and employment with labour schemes that were rolled out across the country. And in a last kind of ditch attempt, many would turn to workhouses as a kind of last refuge, or they would emigrate from the island as well. So in terms of fishing, very, very little could be done because 1, they lacked the equipment in most cases. 2, they lacked the skills or the knowledge of where to go. And again, that just limited what was available to those here on the island.
Is it still within the Irish psyche, the famine, you know, great grandparents, and this idea of wasting food is a sin? You know, it's if you have too much in the fridge, it's kind of seen as, oh, you know, greed or something like that, gluttony. Is it still in the Irish psyche, do you think?
Yeah, I think the famine had a profound impact on what it means to be Irish and on Ireland itself. So obviously, in the wake of the famine, over 1 million people emigrated in the 10 years from 1845 to 1855, mainly to North America. Like, that has spawned a huge Irish diaspora around the world as well. So that diaspora themselves then were involved in the subsequent decades in supporting kind of political causes in Ireland, fundraising, charitable causes. And one of the reasons they gave so generously is because they recalled, or they recalled from family memory, the impact that the famine had in kind of forcing them abroad. Today, I think, yes, it definitely has had an impact on how Irish people relate to food. It's really widely known. People are reluctant to waste food in Ireland. Recipes as well, and the variety of the Irish diet as well has been directly impacted, I think, by it as well. The lumper potato almost vanished from the Irish diet during the late 19th century as well, and was revived in, I think, 2008 in Antrim as a sort of a research study for schools as well, so that they could grow it and become familiar with that. So I think it changed what it meant to be Irish as well. It changed how Irish people lived, it changed Irish society. And nearly 1 million people dying within such a short period of time, and a net immigration from the end of the famine all the way up to the 1960s changed how Irish people perceived themselves, changed how people in Ireland related to their own understanding of what it meant to be Irish as well.
I travelled to the Oak Park Tadgh facility in Carlow to meet with Dennis Griffin, who's a potato breeder.
So Dennis, I'll just get you to fill us in a little bit about how the potato made its way from South America to Ireland and how it kind of settled into Ireland.
The initial potato arrived into Europe in the late 1500s. And evidence would now suggest that that came from that region of Peru or of Andean potatoes that arrived here and were cultivated here. So prior to the famine, a lot of the varieties that we had here were primarily of that Andean stock and were very, very late maturing. Evidence would suggest that potato varieties and introductions of potato germplasm that came in after the famine would have come from Chile, where potato adapted potentially at lower altitudes, and because it's closer to the pole and farther away from the equator, it's more suited to long days and to our conditions. So a lot of the varieties that we have now are short day adapted or are long day adapted potatoes and grow much better under our long summer days of 16 or 17 hours. The genetic base of potato was quite narrow because most of our varieties were bred from a limited number of introductions that came in that period. At the time of the famine, most of the varieties had been grown here for about 150, 200 years without any selection pressure from late blight. So the varieties were very susceptible, and when blight struck, the crop was wiped out. Subsequent breeding efforts at the time of the famine would have focused on breeding. But it was really, I suppose, the introduction of early fungicides, maybe 20 years after the famine. In the early 1900s, some Scottish varieties like Champion became quite popular. And, you still hear a lot of people speaking about Champions, and they were very popular in Ireland up until the 1950s and 1960s.
All right.
When Kerr's Pink and Record and varieties like that began to take over.
Have they disappeared? Consumer demand has fallen off totally for Champions, or are they?
There's small amounts of seed stocks available, but it's almost, it's not grown commercially.
Right.
Yeah.
So yeah, they kind of come and go depending on what people want at the time.
Well, potato varieties, when they're established, take a very long time be replaced. So if you take Kerr's Pink, which was bred in the early 1900s, British Queen, which are still widely grown. Rooster has been on the market for 30 years, so it's a newcomer to the block, but it's very much established as a strong, firm favourite there. And it will still be widely grown for many years to come.
So what's going on here, Dennis?
So this is actually the start of our potato breeding program. We cross two different parents to produce a berry, which is the fruit of the potato plant, which looks like a small green cherry tomato. We remove the seeds from that, and when we grow the seeds, each seed is a potential new variety. And this is an example of a family that's been produced from a single cross, and you can see that there's a huge amount of diversity here.
Most bestsellers, the rooster at the moment, and what would be the kind of hierarchy of them?
Well, I suppose in Ireland, rooster makes up about 60% of the market, and Curse Pink would still be quite a large variety. British Queen, so you know there's a huge preference for British Queen as an early potato from about the end of May, June, July, August, for that period for British Queens, but it's very seasonal. And once you move into August and September, you move into the main crop potatoes, which are traditionally rooster and Curse Pink. There's still a market for Golden Wonder as well, which is a very, very high dry matter potato, particularly in the south of Ireland.
As a complete food, people were able to live on just potatoes, or were they, you know, is that true?
Combined with milk, I mean, potato is a very, very good source of carbohydrates and fibre. It's high in vitamin B, it's high in vitamin C, it's high in potash. So, you know, it's a very, very nutritious food in its own right. Now, we tend to see many of the same varieties due to the storageability of the varieties and also the availability of large cold stores, that the same varieties are available in the supermarkets, particularly rooster, all year round. In the past, white flesh was very, very popular, and this is typical of a white-fleshed potato. And in the UK, still white flesh is very, very popular. And I suppose until the advent of rooster in Ireland, you know, British Queens and Curse Pink would have had a pale yellow to a white flesh, very, very similar to this.
Right, so Dennis, tell us a little bit about the breeding of the potatoes.
So, yeah, we have been breeding potatoes here in Tadhg Park since 1962. And initially, I suppose, the breeding program was set up to come up with blight-resistant alternatives to the main varieties grown at the time, which were Record and Curse Pink. But Ireland is a small market, and the amount of potatoes grown here has been decreasing over the last 50 years. So in the late 1970s, we reached a partnership with a company called IPM Potato Group to breed potatoes internationally for them. And we release 1 to 2 new varieties every year, which are marketed globally, I think in about 50 different countries, and on almost every continent except Antarctica. I think we have varieties present. So to breed potato varieties, when you think of the actual potato, seed potato, that's actually a swollen stem called a tuber, and it's an exact genetic replica or clone of the parent plant. So traditionally, Northern Europe has been a source of seed potatoes and breeding for varieties to be exported to the rest of the world. So particularly in Ireland, Scandinavia, the Netherlands, France, and the UK, is where a lot of the breeding programs.
So there's people eating Irish potatoes all around the world at the moment.
Absolutely, yeah. And interestingly, one of the first varieties that was bred here was Cara. And I mentioned earlier that the Canary Islands were very important in the journey of potatoes from South America to Europe. Interestingly, they grow a lot of potatoes still in the Canary Islands, and one of the few places that can export seed potatoes there are Scotland and Ireland, because we don't have Colorado beetle. So a lot of our varieties, and Cara in particular, was very, very successful in the Canary Islands and is still widely grown there today.
So you mentioned IPM. Can you tell me a little bit more about them and how the partnership came about?
You know, we've been breeding potatoes since 1962, but due to falling consumption, you know, there isn't enough market here to support a breeding program in Ireland. And IPM have been involved in the export of seed potatoes from Ireland, Scotland and Northern Europe since the 1950s. So in the 1970s, a collaboration was reached between the two for IPM to market Tadgh varieties internationally. And one of the first varieties and most successful varieties we had was Cara. And a large part of Cara's trade was actually to the Canary Islands, which was very important in the introduction of potato in the first place. And as part of that, I mentioned earlier that the initial introductions of potato into Europe were long day and short day adapted. Adaptation is very, very important for potato varieties as well. So we run a number of trials to test our varieties at the later stages to make sure that they're able to grow under hot and dry conditions, and to test them for abiotic stress and for market suitability in those countries in conjunction with IPM Potato Group. So
It's kind of in the hope that these countries might adapt these particular varieties that you're trialing here.
Well, absolutely. Well, most of the varieties that are bred here are actually for export markets. So we have over 45 varieties released to date. About 30 of those are still commercially produced in over 50 countries on all continents.
I caught up with my old lecturer Martin McAnummer to learn more about the post-famine diet and the changes in technology that occurred in the 20th century.
In that period, the big changes is that the shop bought food, that commercialization becomes more important because it's part of the Industrial Revolution, and the build-up, the movement into cities, and then the idea about moving to sort of bought breads, basically bread, spreads and teas. Do you know what I mean? Like that's really the big thing in that period, because up until then, most people were sort of self-sufficient, and even in the countryside people were still self-sufficient, but post the famine there was a big movement towards the cities looking for work to do. Rural electrification came to Ireland around the 1950s and transformed how people lived their lives as such, because up until that time, whether it was in the city or out in the countryside, people cooked on an open hearth and basically lived as their ancestors had done for hundreds of years. But with the advent of electricity and gas, suddenly cookers came in, whether they were electric cookers or gas cookers. The electric light came in. Refrigeration was an option, because prior to that, the way people controlled is people used to buy their food regularly, and then they used to store things like milk and butter. They used to store them in basins of cold water. They used to hang meats in what they called meat safes, which were basically frames with netting around them to stop flies getting near them. So all of that was transformed with rural electrification. Basically a combination of the potato, the pig, and milk, really, and oats. They really are the foundation of food of our ancestors. And up until recently, really, most of us have been eating sort of meat and 2 veg. That's really, what Irish food is about. And probably the most quintessential of all of that would be probably bacon and cabbage with some lovely floury potatoes. Ireland has normally been a country linked with emigration as opposed to immigration. But we did notice around 150, 120 years ago that a certain amount of new immigrants started coming to Ireland. Some of them were actually Italian, and they were actually on their way to America. Some Italian migrants actually thought when they were landed in Cove that they were actually in America as such. Some of them came with the skilled artisans who were working as plasterers on the beautiful chapels and churches that sort of emerged post Catholic emancipation, and with that they brought some food traditions with them. But actually, what was interesting is that the food traditions they brought were not actually Italian food traditions. What they did is that they took on this new idea about fish and chips, and fish and chips was a product of the Industrial Revolution, because with the steam engine and with trawlers being able to go out into the North Atlantic and trains being able to transport the fresh fish when it came in out around the countryside, it meant that fresh fish was much more available, and fish and chip shops became a really great way of cooking them quickly, keeping them fresh, and it became a really important part of Irish culinary tradition. The Italians were not the only migrants who came here and who set up food businesses with their fish and chip shops and with their ice cream parlours and their Knickerbocker glories. There were also, believe it or not, there was an Indian restaurant in 1908 on O'Connell Street next to the Gresham Hotel. Now it only lasted a year, but other Indian restaurants came later on, starting around the 1940s, and they've become such an important part of sort of Irish food traditions now. Equally, the Chinese started to emerge again roughly around the 1940s and 50s was the beginning of sort of the Chinese restaurants, and a lot of those people, they came from Hong Kong. There had been trouble in Hong Kong and they came and they set up businesses here. And today there's very few even small towns that would not have some form of Chinese takeaway or Chinese restaurant. And what I love about that is that the food in Ireland in Irish Chinese restaurants are actually slightly different. There's this sort of slightly Irish thing to it, like we invented the spice bag, which is this crazy sort of Irish sort of Asian mixture or melange, and that was invented out in Temple Oak in Dublin.
Meat was still not consumed in huge amounts at the beginning of the 20th century. Chickens would be kept for eggs. So a chicken would be a treat. A chicken might be killed coming to the end of its life, or as I said, for a traditional feast day, they might have a chicken. Geese were kept, but also they were very much associated with traditional celebrations. For example, you might kill a goose was associated with Michaelmas, St. Martin's Eve, Christmas. There's a story goes that if you killed a goose on St. Martin's Eve, you'd put the blood around the four corners, the blood of the goose around the four corners of your house, and that would bring luck for the year. Lamb wasn't eaten until the mid-20th century and was always a treat. It would have been eaten by the nobility. And also, if, say, a lamb or a sheep died by misadventure, it would be eaten in a family situation. But mutton was very common. And that's how we have Irish stew. Mutton would, if a sheep was killed on a farm, then all the offal and spoils would be given to the peasants, and they just throw everything into the pot to make an Irish stew. So that's where we got that from.
Right, so how have consumer demand for meats changed since, the 70s or 60s? Or?
Well, I think in the 60s and 70s, with huge modernisation and huge economical growth, people turned away from traditional foods. For various reasons. There was a certain social squeamishness about eating stuff like offal. Also, with the advent of supermarkets and large supermarkets, people wanted to buy food that all kind of looked the same, and to walk into somewhere and buy a pig's head would be unheard of. They really turned away from all that, and I think that has changed now. I think people, and chefs especially, are looking to reconnect really with our old dishes, and are going back to this nose to tail consumption, possibly because of the recession. People couldn't afford to buy the expensive cuts of meat anymore. So
in the late 80s and 90s, it was all about fillet steak.
All about fillet steak,
Chateaubriand, expensive, lean, no flavour.
Absolutely.
And it kind of flipped maybe somewhere along the line to do with the recession. And
probably the recession.
Lamb shanks coming in again.
Lamb shanks. At one stage
Pork
you could
belly.
go and buy lamb shanks you nearly get them for free from your butcher, and now they're like really expensive. So I think that with more research into Irish food history and more interest, I think that chefs today are turning away from what was traditionally the French way of cooking and looking to the past, to our own past, to find, inspiration from dishes that our forefathers ate.
So we can start to see how foreign ingredients and influences started to slowly creep into the Irish diet. Join me next time as I examine Ireland's Celtic Tiger years and how they changed food in Ireland.